Something extraordinary just happened over Tehran, and most Americans have no idea what it means. A U.S. deployed THAAD battery didn't just intercept a missile, it shot down a Russian-built Su-57, one of Moscow's most advanced fifth-generation stealth fighters, right over Iranian airspace. Let that sink in. We are no longer talking about proxy skirmishes or diplomatic posturing. We are talking about American hardware in real combat conditions, defeating the aircraft that Russia spent decades and billions of dollars developing to counter us. That is a seismic shift, not just militarily, but in the entire global power calculus. Because when you strip away the headlines and the political noise, what this moment really tells you is that the air superiority balance, the one that Russia and China have been quietly challenging for years, just got tested in live fire. And the results are going to reverberate from Moscow to Beijing to every defense ministry watching this unfold in silence. Now, let me walk you through exactly what happened, and more importantly, why it matters far beyond what any cable news anchor is going to tell you tonight. The THAAD system, Terminal High Altitude Area Defense, is not a system that was designed primarily to shoot down aircraft. It was built to intercept ballistic missiles. It was engineered to knock out incoming warheads traveling at extraordinary speeds from extreme altitudes. So when you hear that a THAAD battery engaged and destroyed an Su-57 over Tehran, the first question any serious military mind asks is not whether it happened. It is how the targeting solution was even generated in the first place. That tells you something enormous about the level of battlefield integration that American and Israeli forces have achieved in this theater. The sensor fusion, the real-time data sharing, the kill chain compression, all of it working together seamlessly enough to prosecute an air target with a system that was never originally designed for that mission. That is not an accident. That is years of quiet, deliberate development. Now think about the Su-57 for a moment. Russia has been parading this aircraft as its answer to American fifth-generation dominance. Moscow spent the better part of 2 decades telling the world that the Su-57 was untouchable, that its radar cross-section made it nearly invisible, that its avionics and electronic warfare suite put it in a class that Western air defense systems simply could not reliably engage. They sold that narrative to their own military establishment, to their defense industry, and frankly to a lot of analysts in the West who were willing to take the Russian claims at face value. And now, over the skies of Tehran, that narrative has been shattered, not in a simulation, not in a war game at some think tank outside Washington, in actual combat against a live American-Israeli integrated air defense network. The wreckage of that aircraft is the most honest assessment of Russian fifth-generation capability that the world has ever received. And you have to understand what this means for Iran, because Iran is not just a bystander in this equation. Tehran has built its entire strategic deterrence posture around the assumption that Russian and Chinese military technology could neutralize American power projection in the region. That is the foundation of their calculations. When Iranian military planners sit down and assess how they survive a direct confrontation with the United States or Israel, a significant portion of that assessment rests on the belief that advanced Russian platforms give them or their allies a credible fighting chance. That belief just took a catastrophic blow. Because if the Su-57, the crown jewel of Russian aerospace engineering, can be engaged and destroyed by a system that was not even primarily designed to fight aircraft, then every assumption Tehran has made about the regional balance of power needs to be completely re-examined from the ground up. But here is where it gets even more complicated, and this is the part that very few people in mainstream media are willing to discuss honestly. Russia's response to this event is going to tell us everything about where Moscow actually stands in relation to Tehran right now, because the relationship between Russia and Iran has never been as solid as both governments publicly claim. It has always been transactional. Russia uses Iran when it serves Russian interests, and Iran tolerates Russian involvement because it needs the military and diplomatic cover. But when Russian hardware gets destroyed in Iranian airspace, in a theater where Russia has been positioning itself as the indispensable security guarantor, Moscow faces a brutal choice. Do they escalate and risk a direct confrontation with American and Israeli forces in a theater where they are already stretched thin? Or do they absorb the humiliation quietly and hope that nobody draws the obvious conclusions about what just happened to their most advanced combat aircraft? Neither option is comfortable. Neither option preserves the image that Putin has spent years carefully constructing. And let us talk about China, because Beijing is watching all of this with extraordinary attention. China has been investing massively in its own fifth-generation and next-generation air combat programs. The J-20, the FC-31, the programs that are still classified and not yet publicly acknowledged, all of them are being developed based on certain assumptions about what Western air defense systems can and cannot do. Every Chinese aerospace engineer and every PLA Air Force planner is right now running the same mental calculation. If the THAAD-based integrated network that Americans and Israelis deployed over Tehran can prosecute a target like the Su-57, what does that mean for Chinese platforms that were designed using many of the same fundamental principles? The electromagnetic signature reduction techniques, the airframe geometry, the electronic warfare assumptions. A lot of that foundational engineering philosophy is shared between Russian and Chinese advanced aviation programs, because China has spent years acquiring Russian technology, both legally and otherwise. So this is not just a Russian problem. This is a problem for every adversary that has been betting against American technological superiority. Now, I want to be direct with you about something that bothers me deeply when I watch how this story is being covered, or rather how it is not being covered. There is a tendency in American media and in American political culture to treat events like this as simple victories, to put up a graphic, run a ticker across the bottom of the screen, give a retired general 30 seconds to say something vague about American strength, and then move on to the next story. And that kind of coverage does a profound disservice to the American people, because it prevents any serious public conversation about what these events actually mean strategically and what they are going to cost us going forward. Because make no mistake, what happened over Tehran does not end the conflict. It intensifies it. When you humiliate a great power's military technology in front of the entire watching world, you do not produce caution and restraint in that power. You produce anger, desperation, and a determination to restore credibility by whatever means necessary. That is not speculation. That is the consistent pattern of great power behavior throughout all of modern history. Russia will respond. The question is how and where. And the options available to Moscow are not limited to the skies over Tehran. Russia has relationships, capabilities, and pressure points spread across multiple continents. They can make things more difficult in Syria. They can accelerate certain relationships in Africa that undermine American interests. They can push harder in the information environment, particularly targeting American domestic political divisions that have already proven to be a significant vulnerability. They can provide Iran with more capable systems, not because they want Iran to win, but because a prolonged conflict that bleeds American resources and attention serves Russian strategic interests, even if individual Russian platforms are destroyed in the process. This is how great powers operate when they are under pressure. They do not always respond where you expect them to respond. And Iran itself is in a very dangerous psychological and strategic moment right now. A government that has built its legitimacy partly on resistance to American and Israeli power has now watched that resistance posture take a very public, very visible beating. Internally, that creates enormous pressure. The hardliners within the Iranian establishment are not going to look at what happened over Tehran and conclude that they need to negotiate. They are going to look at what happened and conclude that they need to escalate, that they need to demonstrate that Iran has not been broken, that the resistance axis is still capable of striking back with force. That internal political dynamic inside Tehran is perhaps the most dangerous element of the entire situation right now, because it can produce decisions that are not rationally calculated from a pure military standpoint, but are driven instead by the need to manage domestic political survival. What the American people deserve to understand is that this is not a contained event. The skies over Tehran are not separate from the broader architecture of global power that is currently being renegotiated with extraordinary speed. We are living through a period where the post-Cold War order, the set of assumptions and institutions and relationships that governed international affairs since 1991, is visibly collapsing. And the military engagements that are happening in places like Tehran, in Ukraine, in the South China Sea, in the Red Sea, These are not isolated conflicts. They are symptoms of that larger structural collapse. Every one of these engagements feeds information into the calculations of every major power about what the new order is going to look like and who is going to have the leverage to shape it. American technological superiority demonstrated over Tehran is a real asset in that competition. It matters. But technological superiority alone has never been sufficient to determine the outcome of great power competition. What ultimately determines those outcomes is strategic coherence, the ability of a nation to translate its military and economic advantages into durable political results. And that is where I think the most important and most uncomfortable questions need to be asked. Not about the performance of THAAD, not about the radar cross-section of the Su-57, but about whether the United States has a coherent strategic vision for what it is trying to achieve in this region, and whether the American political system is capable of sustaining the kind of long-term strategic patience that turning these tactical victories into lasting strategic outcomes actually requires. Because the American people are not being given a serious answer to that question. They are being given victory footage and impressive graphics. And while the footage is real and the capability is genuinely impressive, the absence of a clear, honest strategic framework for understanding what we are doing and why and at what cost, that absence is itself a form of strategic vulnerability. Our adversaries understand our political cycles. They understand that American attention is limited and that American domestic politics can be weaponized against American strategic consistency, and they are patient in ways that our political culture generally is not. What happened over Tehran is significant. The destruction of a Russian-built Su-57 by a U.S.-Israeli integrated system is a genuine demonstration of where the military technology balance stands today. It will reshape calculations in Moscow, Beijing, and Tehran. It will accelerate certain programs and force certain reassessments. It is a moment that serious students of military affairs and geopolitics will study for years, but it is not the end of the story. In many ways, it is the beginning of a far more complicated and far more dangerous chapter, and the American people deserve leaders and a media landscape that treats them as adults capable of understanding that complexity, rather than simply feeding them highlights and asking them to feel good about it. The world is changing faster than most people realize, and the events unfolding over places like Tehran are the visible surface of tectonic shifts happening underneath. Pay attention, ask hard questions, and do not let anyone on any side of the political spectrum reduce what is happening to a simple narrative of good versus evil, victory versus defeat. Reality is almost always more complicated than that, and understanding that complexity is not weakness. It is the beginning of genuine wisdom about the world we actually live in.